on the, go ahead. Tom's getting it on the YouTube as well. Great, so we're going to have, a regular order. Guest speaker goes first, 12 minutes. Then Mr. Simmons will be speaking to us. He doesn't have to join us on Skype, obviously. He's right here in person. He'll go for 12 minutes. We'll have the 10-minute rebuttals in the same order, and then we'll have a question and answer session with the audience. And there is more pizza, so if you've only got 2 slices before because you were generous, feel free to help yourselves and join the line and get another slice. We should be good to go. I'm going to do the introductions for our speakers, and then we will get going in the next few minutes, starting off with Professor Kunich. I'll start with the introduction for Professor Simmons. Professor Rick Simmons is the Zen Master of Evidence Law. He's a graduate of Columbia Law School, where he was a Stone Scholar and senior editor of the Columbia Law Review. Professor Simmons served for 4 years as an assistant district attorney in New York County, and he was an acting assistant professor at NYU School of Law from 2000 to 2003. Here he teaches evidence, what else? Criminal law and the prosecution practicum, and is the author of what can only be described as the best damn law school book of all time, Learning Evidence from the Federal Rules to the Courtroom. And Professor John Kunich is the author of 7 books, including Betting the Earth, How We Can Still Win the Biggest Gamble of All Time. This book is the only one to be endorsed by Harvard, Duke, and Notre Dame professors, a U.S. congressman, and famed poker pro Barry Greenstein. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School and is an LLM in environmental law from George Washington University. To go with his bachelor's and master of science degrees in biological sciences from the University of Illinois. And I should mention he is a diehard Cubs fan, so if you ever meet him outside of this event, be sure to give him props for that. He served 20 years in the Air Force JAG, including assignments at the Headquarters Air Force Environmental Law and Litigation Division as the Chief Environmental Attorney for the U.S. and Air Force Space Command. He's twice testified before the U.S. Congress on environmental issues. Recently, Professor Kunich served as a Fulbright Senior Specialist at the India Law Institute in New Delhi, India, where he taught some of my cousins, actually. So we're very pleased to have him. We're going to start with Professor Kunich. We'll reconnect the audio. Professor Kunich, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
All right. Professor Kunich, the floor is yours for the next 12 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much for letting me participate through my avatar. I really apologize I couldn't be there in person, but sort of like in the first episode of Star Wars, actually episode 4, I'm like Obi-Wan Kenobi, a holographic image, and that's probably better than actually having me there. I can be much more annoying when I'm there in the flesh. So thanks for having me today, and hopefully you'll have my slides on the projector there. I'm going to start with a slide that has Why Arizona at the top. And just to preface this, it's very easy in discussions like this one to wind up in ad hominem attacks, to name call, to portray the other side as if they were evil or ignorant, or possibly both in my case. But I maintain that the people in Arizona who passed this law did not do so for malevolent reasons. They did so for really practical, powerful reasons that mean something to them. And so it's useful just to take a quick look at why they did it. Is Arizona a hotbed of xenophobia, racism, ethnocentrism, Nazism, or why else would they do something like this law? Basically, Arizona's been on the front lines of the problem of illegal immigration for a long time, at least for the last 20 years, as you can see from the slide. And basically, with a huge influx of undocumented or illegal aliens, their system has been overtaxed in many ways, in terms of law enforcement, social services, including education, healthcare, problems of unemployment of their actual legal citizens and legal immigrants being crowded out of jobs by people without documentation coming over the border. And you've probably heard many of the horrific reports coming out of Mexico over the last several months, these terrible killings, mutilations. The risk of that spreading into Arizona and the rest of the country is a very real one in Arizona. It's easy from the standpoint of Ohio to say, well, they should just live and let live and not worry about the problem to the extent that they have. But they are dealing with the rising incidence of drug crime, violent crime, murders, and they are dealing with it every day. And that explains why they did it. It's not that Arizona is an especially intolerant or xenophobic state. Let's go to the next slide, the root causes. Basically, what they're doing with this law is trying to enforce the federal law for a long time, and that, in their view, Washington isn't enforcing. They say, we know that there is this federal law, we know that it's largely the province of the federal government through the Supremacy Clause to make uniform laws for the whole nation. The problem is, they're not enforcing this law, and we are going to help with the implementation and enforcement of a law that's on the books. And basically, non-citizens have been required by federal law for some 70 years to carry proof of their legal residence when they are out and about. Green card, work visa, etc. That's nothing new. It's been the law of the land for a long time. And Arizona is feeling the effects of the federal lax enforcement of this law. Basically, the feds are doing very little to enforce this, and so one thing that occurred to the folks in Arizona, being besieged as they are with this rising tide of crime resulting from illegal immigration, let's try to strengthen the enforcement of the pre-existing federal law, not change it, not add to it, not in any way conflict with it, but simply to use it as a basis for our own law that will help us to protect our own borders and our own citizens and lawful non-citizens. Let's go to the next slide if we could. Of course, the Supremacy Clause does make federal law the supreme law of the land, and the federal government does have broad and exclusive authority to regulate immigration. The problem is, how do you tell when that power is being overreached, is being violated? Basically, the Canas v. Bica decision shows, as indicated on the slide, that not every state enactment which in any way deals with aliens is a regulation of immigration and is thus preempted by the constitutional power. The states do have some room for legislation in this area, and the feds have not really occupied the field. Let's go to the next slide. As you probably know, there are two forms of preemption. This is not field preemption. Supreme Court decisions have held that the federal government has not completely occupied the field on immigration. There is room for state law on the matter. So if what Arizona has done is preempted by the Supremacy Clause, and it would have to be on the basis of conflict preemption, which is a much more limited and much more rigorous test. Basically, you only have conflict preemption if compliance with both federal and state regulations is a physical impossibility or where state law stands as an obstacle to the accomplishment and execution of the full purposes and objectives of Congress. This has to be a real and actual rather than a potential or hypothetical conflict. So do we have that here? Is that what's going on with this Arizona law? Let's go to the next slide. Is it true that Arizona's law has conflicted with federal law because it's imposed substantial burdens on lawful immigrants in a way that frustrates Congress's policy, or has somehow overburdened the federal government, put so much stress on federal resources that the feds cannot do their assigned duties? What has Arizona done, basically? Many people oppose the Arizona illegal immigration law without ever having actually looked at its provisions. And so we're not going to have time to get through all that, but many of my slides actually have verbatim excerpts from the law. Virtually the whole law is in the latter portion of my slides. Let's look at some of the key issues, just boiling down the law to its main points and see, is there anything here that crosses the line that would be an example of the conflict with federal law that would cause the law to be invalidated and unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here are the main provisions of the law. As I said, for a long time, the U.S. federal law has required all so-called aliens, 14 years old and older, who are in the country for longer than 30 days, to register with the government and have their documents in their possession at all times. A lot of people aren't aware of that. They think, well, let me see your documentation is a phrase only uttered in Nazi Germany or perhaps other totalitarian regimes. Actually, for a long time, that has been the law of the land in the United States. Often ignored, rarely enforced, but it is the law of the land, and it's the law of the land for a reason. Sometimes you want to be able to have law enforcement officials ascertain whether somebody is a lawful resident of this country or not. And what does the Arizona law do? It makes it a state misdemeanor for an alien to be in Arizona without carrying the federally required documents. It doesn't impose any new documents, any Arizona sanctioned document that supplants or in any way replaces the federal documents. It just says those documents that the federal law requires a person in this country to maintain on their person, you have to have at least one of those with you. We're going to enforce the federal law. And here's where a lot of people say the real problem is. The Arizona law requires police, when making a lawful stop, detention, or arrest, there has to already be a lawful stop, detention, or arrest for some other purpose to ascertain the person's immigration status if there is, quote, reasonable suspicion that the person is an illegal alien. Okay? They can't release the person who is so suspected of being an illegal alien without confirmation of that person's legal right to be in the country through consultation with the federal government. So the Arizona law sets up a consultation requirement where if there is a lawful stop and there's reasonable suspicion that the person's an illegal alien, that they have to coordinate with the federal government and get the go-ahead to say, all right, they are lawfully in this country, you can let them go. They're not supposed to release any person until they get that authorization. Now, what happens if the federal government is slow in giving those assurances? What happens if, as often is the case, the federal offices are understaffed, overworked, underpaid, and they can't get to it right away? These are the inefficiencies, the problems that exist in any governmental bureaucracy. If that's a problem, if the feds are not used to answering a fair number of inquiries about the legal status of immigrants because they haven't been enforcing their own law for so long, that's not Arizona's fault, and it's not a constitutional defect in the Arizona law. It's a problem that the federal government has to address, maybe by adding more employees, paying their workers better, providing supplemental help to make sure that there are adequate people there to ensure that the federal law is being adequately implemented and enforced. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is really the core issue on the Arizona law, and this is going to be the last slide that I'll actually use right now. People who are opposed to this law often say, well, this gives Arizona police officers carte blanche to pull over people who are on their way to get ice cream and say, that person looks like they might be Hispanic or perhaps African origin, perhaps East Asian origin. I'm going to pull them over at random and just say, let me see your identification, let me see your green card or visa or passport, what have you. And basically, the image is that, like in Nazi Germany, people will be pulled over for no reason and summarily subjected to very embarrassing, intrusive exercises of police misconduct, embarrassing families in front of their children, where they're just out to get ice cream, saying, let me see your documentation. Remember, the Arizona law only goes into effect in any individual case if there's already a prior legal contact for some reason unrelated to the person's immigration status. There has to be some reason for a lawful stop, as you talked about in your crim law, criminal procedure classes, some reason to stop them, whether it's for a traffic violation, suspicion of some other crime. That is the prerequisite, the predicate before which all else cannot take place. So once you have that prior legal contact, the person is stopped for some reason unrelated to immigration status, then what happens next? How do you arrive at the requisite reasonable suspicion of an illegal presence in this country? People who are concerned about this say, once you give police this kind of power, you can always manufacture a reason for a valid stop. You know, who hasn't rolled through a stop sign or maybe exceeded the speed limit or something like that. Once you have that, what constitutes reasonable suspicion of illegal presence in the United States? It just seems to smack of profiling, right? Somebody who appears to be of Middle Eastern origin, Hispanic origin, East Asian origin, somebody who, quote, looks like people from those parts of the world. It would seem natural that the police would look at those kinds of outward indicia of ethnicity to say that's suspicion of illegal presence in the United States. The law specifically bans use of race or ethnicity as any grounds for formulating this reasonable suspicion. You are not able to use either race or ethnicity in formulating this reasonable suspicion. The law is very clear on that. It absolutely forbids those profiling type techniques. Because of that, in theory at least, and I hope in actuality, the number of instances of reasonable suspicion of illegal presence following that requisite legal stop for other reasons should be relatively low, because other than race or ethnicity, what would cause the police to suspect somebody is illegally in the country? Evidence of work documents that look like they perhaps have been fraudulently completed, forged. What would constitute that? It would have to be a relatively low number of cases, which also tends to undermine the argument that this is going to flood the federal bureaucracy and overwhelm the people who are working to answer questions as to whether somebody is in the country legally or not. It's a very limited measure, strictly limited to these specific situations, and it is designed to provide a non-racist, non-ethnocentric safeguard on illegal immigration. Some brakes, some control, some filter to get some handle on the influx of illegal immigration into Arizona, which has been on the front lines for so long and has had to pay so heavy a price in dealing with this problem, while the rest of us sit safely thousands of miles away. I'll stop here and leave time for my opponent.
All right, we'll head now to Professor Simmons.
All right, thank you, Federalist Society, for inviting me to my opponent, I suppose, in this. It's a pleasure to engage in this debate. As far as Arizona immigration law, SB 1070, a number of objections to it on many different levels. I'm only going to go into a couple of them in depth, but I'm not going to talk about, for example, why it's a bad idea politically, although I think it is a disaster politically for the Republican Party, which I've been a member of my whole life. I think it'll destroy the Republican Party in Arizona. In California, 20 years ago, there was Prop 187, which essentially destroyed the Republican Party there for 20 years. It used to be a very strong presence there. That was a proposition that was meant to deny immigrants, illegal immigrants, basic health care and education. It was struck down by a court 2 years later. It's unconstitutional, but not before it essentially made Republicans a non-entity in that state. Same thing will happen in Arizona, I predict. This bill is opposed by 81% of Latino voters, who will already make up 31% of Arizona's population, and it's only growing, obviously. Latinos will be, by 2050, 25% of the national population. So this is a good idea on a national level for Republicans to get behind this. I think that's a mistake. I don't think it's a bad idea economically. It's going to hurt Arizona's economy. Immigrants are leaving the state. 100,000 Latinos have left the state since this bill was passed. It's not illegal, some illegal. Study after study has shown that immigrants, legal or illegal, help the state's economy in the long run. They're good for the economy, and to chase them away is bad for growth. I think it's almost certainly unconstitutional under the Supremacy Clause. I disagree, obviously. I do think it is preempted by the federal government's power to regulate immigration. But I want to go into, as a matter of criminal law, which is what I know the most about, and which I can say with certainty it's a terrible idea. It'll make the people in Arizona actually less safe. It'll encourage police to violate the Constitution in making these stops and in detaining people. And ultimately, it's unenforceable, I think. So if you look at we already saw the text of the law here. For any lawful stop, detention, or arrest, if reasonable suspicion exists that the person is an alien who is unlawfully present in the United States, a reasonable attempt will be made when practicable to determine the immigration status of the person. This was called the law was actually called the Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act. In fact, it's going to do just the opposite. It's not an act that the Arizona Association of Chiefs of Police opposed the legislation. They said the bill was problematic. It would negatively affect the ability of law enforcement to fulfill their main responsibilities. And they said that illegal immigrants will come and fear the police, not contact them when there was trouble, not cooperate with the police. The first 3 lawsuits of the many lawsuits brought against this law, the first was the National Coalition of Latino Clergy and Christian Leaders. The next 2 were brought by police officers. A Tucson police officer who said that there was no way to do this without using race and racial profiling. And the police officer in Kunich claimed that we'd have to violate the rights of Hispanics in order to enforce this law. Obviously, there are many suits against this law, backed by some of the usual suspects, the ACLU. It's also opposed by the Attorney General of Arizona and the government of Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, essentially every Latin American country, as well as the Attorney General of the United States. So why is there a problem as a matter of criminal law? Why will it make the Arizonans and the neighborhoods less safe? Well, first, it drains law enforcement resources away from what I would call real crime that actually harms people. There was already some mention about some of the alleged atrocities that might have occurred by crimes that illegal aliens might have committed in Arizona before this. I have no problem that if illegal aliens or anyone else commits a crime against somebody, to arrest them for that crime. This seems like a distraction from the police who are actually trying to, and should be trying to, find people who are actually committing crimes that are actually hurting people. That's like theft and murder, rape, and so on. To try and make them, to try and deputize them all as immigration officials seems like a misuse of resources. More importantly, as a former prosecutor who worked with police officers quite a bit, I can tell you the most important way to keep streets safe is to make sure you have good cooperation between the people, the civilians out there in the neighborhoods, and the police officers. Where you have high crime rates, probably the most important factor is whether or not, how much the people out there cooperate with the police. You get cooperation, you get people calling the police, you get people cooperating with the prosecution, you get people testifying, then you can lower the crime rate. This will do just the opposite. In neighborhoods where we have the most amount of danger, we're going to have people, illegal or otherwise, who are afraid to contact police, who are afraid to get involved in the system because they're worried that now the police are going to be acting as INS or ICE agents and detaining them while they can check their papers. So I think it'll make the neighborhoods less safe. I think also encourage police to violate the Constitution in 2 ways. One through racial profiling, and I'm aware that the law specifically says that we will not, they are not allowed to racially profile. I think that's a fantasy. I think there's no way you can have this kind of law and give police this responsibility and expect them not to use that as a factor. We've been working for 20 years, maybe 30 years now, state after state, to try and prevent police officers from using race as a factor they consider when they pull people over, when they make a stop on the streets. And this is quite obviously, I think, a step backwards in that. If they're now going to look at people and try to determine their status, immigration status in this country. They're not qualified to do it, they're not trained to do it, and that it's going to be inevitable they're going to have to use racial profiling to do so. But in addition to the racial profiling, I think we have a bigger problem with the term reasonable suspicion. And a lot of you probably have taken criminal procedure and know about the different levels of suspicion that you could have when a police officer approaches a citizen. What this law does essentially makes illegal status in the United States a state crime under Arizona law. It allows police to detain based on reasonable suspicion, not probable cause, which is the touchstone for any prolonged detention under our criminal procedure jurisprudence. So in other words, we have reasonable suspicion that someone is an illegal alien or does not have status in the United States. That's a crime. You can then detain them based on reasonable suspicion. We can't do that for any other crime. Terrorism, murder, rape, robbery, you need probable cause to detain somebody. But for this, for being undocumented in this country, then you can detain them with only reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion is, it has to be based on specific and articulable facts, taking together rational inference from those facts. It's much less than probable cause. Police have to have a reasonable suspicion the person is or about to be engaged in criminal activity, in this case, not being in this country with the proper documentation. You might be familiar with Terry stops. Police are allowed to stop you based on reasonable suspicion. They're allowed to talk to you briefly. If they think that they are in danger, they're allowed to frisk you, make sure you're not carrying weapons. A Terry stop is a very brief encounter that's been authorized by the court. which is necessary for the officer's safety. We're talking much more than that here. Officers, after they determine they have reasonable suspicion, they are supposed to hold the suspect until the immigration status can be verified. We already heard that this might be difficult to do. I think it might be much more than difficult to do, which is my last point, which is that it is unenforceable in the end. It is actually quite difficult to verify an individual's immigration status in this context. Although some people in this country are required to carry documentation, that's not true for everyone. It's not true, obviously, for people who are only here for 14 days or less. They don't have to require documentation. There are a number of countries that, where people can enter here as a visa waiver country. In other words, they come in without needing a visa to enter here, to stay for 30 days, 60 days, and they have no documentation aside from maybe their passport that they're a citizen of another country. They won't have a visa in it to show that they're here legally. Even if it does have a visa, if they're from a country that requires a visa, they come in as a tourist visa, but they're actually working illegally, there's no way to tell that in their passport. Furthermore, you're telling all the people who visit this country, maybe they see the Grand Canyon, to visit relatives in Arizona, they have to carry their passport with them at all times or risk being detained for some period of time. And of course, the one group of people that does not have to carry documentation to prove their citizenship status under any law are United States citizens, whom this will affect undoubtedly. They will be, if you have reasonable suspicion that someone is illegal in this country, even if the person's a citizen, as long as there's suspicion, they can detain you, try and verify you're a citizen, which means, I suppose, if you have brown skin, then you carry your birth certificate with you, you carry some kind of documentation that you might not want to carry with you all the time. That's what you're requiring in the Arizona law, in fact. The Arizona law enforcement, when some of them reluctantly decided they might have to enforce this law, they came up with a list of factors they could look at to determine whether or not there was reasonable suspicion. And some of the standard reasonable suspicion factors you might consider: if someone looks like they're engaging in evasive maneuvers, if they're hiding when the police officers show up, if they're traveling in an overcrowded vehicle. Others, if they possess a foreign identification, that could give rise, or a factor could give rise to reasonable suspicion. The way they dress, it just says the way they dress could be a factor. Not sure what that means, but a police officer can use that however he or she wants. Or if they have significant difficulty communicating in English, that could also be a suspicion under the Arizona guidelines given to their police officers. And I think these are problematic to say the least. We might say we're not racial profiling, but again, it's hard to avoid the thought that this actually will occur. So I'll stop there and give a chance for rebuttal. I also want to get a chance for questions from the audience, so I'll turn it back over and we'll go to the rebuttals. Thanks.
All right, well, we heard a lot of good points on the policy implications of this, whether it's a good idea, whether it's going to be effective, whether it will do what Arizona intends for it to do or not, whether there will be problems in implementation, whether it will be difficult for police officers to carry out the intent of the law. Heard very little, if anything, on the unconstitutionality of this law, which is the main point we're here to debate today. Is this law unconstitutional? There's really nothing to suggest that this is violative of either field preemption or conflict preemption. It's simply asking the Arizona police to enforce a long-standing, well-established federal law, not add to it, not change it, simply to enforce it. And to the extent that maybe the standard for reasonable suspicion is less than that required to detain anyone for another violation or crime, that problem is not Arizona's problem, it's the problem of the feds. If they have adequate resources devoted to answering questions from the Arizona police officers, nobody should be detained for more than a few minutes. A matter of quickly doing a check, the same type of check that's routinely done on me when I'm pulled over for a suspected violation of the speeding laws, something that's happened to me once or twice in my life. The cops quickly do a check of my driving records, realize I'm a wanted felon, and I'm off to the holding facility in a few minutes. But somebody who's law-abiding, they're cleared immediately, and if the feds take this problem seriously and put some real resources behind answering these inquiries from the Arizona police officers, there should be no reason to detain people who aren't actually unlawfully in this country for more than a few minutes. the same kind of thing that happens for any traffic stop in this country on an everyday basis around the nation. Now, to suggest that this is an outrageous overreaching by the Arizona state government and that it's widely disapproved of by governments in Mexico and other Latin American nations is to ignore the fact that those nations, without exception, have similar requirements in their own nation. They require people who are in that nation for any reason, who aren't citizens of their nation, to carry documentation with them at all times. Why? Because they are sovereign nations and they like to protect their sovereign borders just like any nation would, just like the United States does with its laws on the books, and just like Arizona is trying to do with this law. They're trying to protect their borders. If these other nations are so upset by what Arizona is doing, maybe they should liberalize their own standards to let Americans come into their country and not have to carry documentation with them at all times. I recently came back from a Fulbright specialist assignment in New Delhi, India, where I was there for 6 weeks. And believe me, I carried my American passport with me at all times when I left my room. And I didn't consider it a violation of my human rights or my civil rights in any way to do it. It's taken for granted when you visit somebody else's nation that you abide by their laws, and it's reasonable for every nation to expect their visitors to have documentation proving that they're there lawfully. That's not unreasonable, and it's certainly not unconstitutional. Basically, the problems that we've heard about are problems of implementation. Is it going to be easy to enforce? No, of course not. No law in this era of the war on terror, with dangerous and unstable conditions all around the world, is easy to enforce when it impacts on those key issues. It's not easy to defend a nation in a dangerous world like we live in today, but it doesn't have to be a matter of surrendering every time we encounter some difficulties. If police officers require training and additional resources in order to be able to implement and execute this law effectively, then that's where we should be throwing our attention, not towards repealing this law and basically surrendering our borders without a fight. These are important issues, and unless we think this is an anti-Latin American law, keep in mind that it applies to people who are here from any other country, people who might be here who are representatives of terrorist organizations from any part of the world who happen to enter Arizona through Mexico, perhaps indirectly working their way through Latin America to come here. They are subject to this law for very good reason. They perhaps are here to engage in terrorist activities, not just to get a job, not just to go get ice cream, but here to endanger and kill American citizens in large numbers. It is a good idea to give our law enforcement officers tools like this to enable them to have some reason to apprehend these people, to give them some legal top cover when they're on the front lines of not only the war on protecting our borders, but the war on terror. And I'll stop there.
All right, we'll hear now a rebuttal from Professor Simmons, and then we will go to questions from the audience.
Well, I think the question of the constitutionality of the law as far as the supremacy clause is certainly an open question, and reasonable minds can and do, and right now are disagreeing about this as it's making its way through the Ninth Circuit as to whether or not it is preempted by federal law. I will say that it is a bit more complicated than we might have heard. The federal immigration law does create a very complex administrative structure about how to enforce the immigration law. It has various specific provisions where it delegates to civil authorities certain specific times when they can enforce immigration law and how they should enforce it. And so it does have, the federal regulation does have some specific ways that we are intended to use to enforce illegal immigration law. As far as the other points here, I think it is true that this is, I will concede that the federal government has not done its job in Arizona and other border states in perhaps protecting those borders. I can see this as perhaps a way to try and get the federal government to step up and take that responsibility. But I can see better ways of doing that than passing a law like this. I think this law has too many costs for this. It was mentioned that this applies not just to people from Latin America, but to people here from any other country. Well, that's actually not entirely true. It applies to everybody here, including citizens. It applies to everybody for whom the police might develop reasonable suspicion that they're illegally here. It'd be wonderful if we could say it's only going to be enforced against people illegally here, but of course that's not true. It would be wonderful in criminal procedure if we knew we're only going to arrest people who we know are guilty. That's not how it works. That's why we have very specific protections and provisions as far as what the police have to develop before they can arrest and detain somebody. In this case, they can now detain someone until they can figure out what their lawful status is. They'll detain citizens and non-citizens alike, people here legally or non-citizens and illegally, until they can figure out their immigration status. And so, as far as need to carry papers, again, that is true. Other countries might require that. We don't require our citizens to do it here, and I would not like to be in a country where we do require that. If I was defending a nation in a dangerous world, I'm all in favor of defending a nation in a dangerous world. I would be in favor of restricting immigration at the border to try to prevent dangerous people from coming in. Again, I see this, if you want to talk in a broader context, as again more of a distraction. We want to keep dangerous people out of our country. We can do better than just trying to keep everyone out of the country and try to track down people who are here, who are otherwise abiding by the law and otherwise working and raising families and being model residents of this country. I don't understand why it makes it safer to track down people who are otherwise not committing any crimes. That's helping us keep our country safe. I'll stop with that, though. I do want to get a chance to answer questions and for Kunich to answer questions as well.
All right, we'll go to the questions from the audience now. Let me just give it a second for the screen to show up. All right, questions for our other speakers? Yes.
First, I'm opposed to SB 1070. I'm from Arizona, grew up there, went to college there, just attending law school here in Columbus. Second, among the Federalist Society, you'll find conservatives and libertarians who take a more open border stance, probably more so than a lot of liberals and Democrats that are here in the audience. But thirdly, Professor Simmons, gird your loins, because I'm going to argue with you a little bit. What I found disingenuous, when the bill first came out, I had the same sort of policy reaction that you expressed in this audience. Oh my gosh, what are the Republicans doing? This is going to be bad politically. Secondly, I felt that if this is what they're going to be doing, this isn't going to help the state deal with its real immigration problem in the long run. But then I decided to do research on my own and read the text of the bill. And that's what I suggest that everybody in this audience does. It's a page. It'll take less than 2 minutes of your time. Once you read the text of the bill, you will find the problems with the bill have been greatly exaggerated. If you read it, I mean, a presumption of citizenship, everybody, when the police pull someone over, if they've done something unlawful, a driver's license is a presumption of citizenship. So I ask you to read the bill and come to your own conclusion. I might still be opposed to the bill, but it is not the Fourth Reich rising. It's not the new Nazi Germany in Arizona. And I find it a little offensive sometimes when somebody puts my home state where I grew up in that light. But I would like to hear some specific provisions, Professor Simmons, of the bill that maybe that you find that there's a problem with. And then Professor Kunich, maybe you can answer why you feel that there is a problem with those provisions, or if you see that there are problems there.
I think you have a good point. I do think that some of the, when I was preparing for the debate, I found some of the rhetoric on both sides of the media, which is unsurprising, certainly these days. My primary objective to the law is the provision we've been talking about, which is the reasonable suspicion provision. I think that is problematic from a criminal procedure standpoint. I think the words of their text is there, and I think the idea that you can detain somebody to determine immigration status could be quite a long detention indeed, longer than certainly is authorized by a Terry stop or existing Supreme Court jurisprudence. And I don't want to get into too much of a brawl about this, but I think that if Arizona wants to get this debate, they have to deal with the repercussions of it. They have now taken a stance on where they want to be on the illegal immigration issue, and frankly, that inevitably means they're going to be seen a certain way in the national media. I think if you're going to again pass a law where reasonable suspicion could exist, and we have provisions which say that the way you speak, the way you dress, could give rise to reasonable suspicion that you're not here in this country, you're going to be unwelcoming to specific Latinos. I know it applies to other races in that case as well. But that's what you end up with. You can't have it both ways. And I think, frankly, Arizona's going to be on the wrong side of history on this. I think it's going to look back 30, 40 years, and they'll be embarrassed that they did this to people, both illegal immigrants who are not doing anything wrong other than not having the right documents when they came to this country. Something that wasn't a crime for most of the history of this country, but has been, obviously, is now a crime. But otherwise, people are, again, they're raising families, they're working, but they pay taxes, and then to single them out as people who are somehow in danger, to lump them in with, as the governor did, with some massacres that happened, that's the choice you make. And I think it's going to be, ultimately proved to be an embarrassment as enforcement of Jim Crow laws was 30, 40 years ago in the southern states. That's the battle you've chosen to fight. So again, that might seem exaggeration. I think history will tell how that ends up. I'll let
Okay. Thank you. Basically, as I'm the son of immigrants myself, and I grew up in a largely immigrant neighborhood in Chicago, and it's very easy from a standpoint of thousands of miles away to second guess a border state like Arizona, but I have read some poll results taken within Arizona, including within the Hispanic community, and I have seen broad support for this law, including amongst Hispanics. The people who are law-abiding, the people who have gone through the steps at significant inconvenience and personal effort to become citizens or properly documented aliens, resent and fear those who violate the law and threaten them and the nation that they are legally present in. And they are in support of this law because they live every day with the consequences of the lax or non-existent enforcement of the federal law. This law is not perfect, but it's a first step to try to get a hold of this problem and providing some tools for protecting people who are lawfully in this country, be they Hispanic or any other ethnic group. As long as they are here legally, they are deserving of the protections of this nation. People who violate our laws, including our immigration laws, need to be dealt with, and this law is not an unreasonable attempt to do so. People who carry any of these forms of documentation on their person are presumed to be lawfully in this country. That's not too much to ask as a step towards safeguarding our own citizens and safeguarding our borders.
Other questions? Yes.
Professor Simmons, is your concern to be lessened if the standard is set at probable cause for detention rather than reasonable suspicion?
Yeah, my constitutional concerns would be eased almost completely. Again, whether or not it's a supremacy clause or preemption, that's a closer call. But yeah, I think that would be not as problematic. I still have my policy objections to it, but I don't think it would be. I think constitutionally it wouldn't worry me as much. It wouldn't give the police that kind of power authorization. So that's it would ease my mind a bit.
Yes.
I actually read the bill. I think what's most embarrassing is how sloppy it's written and how overly broad it is. There's a provision in this bill that makes it a crime to transport in a motor vehicle an illegal alien. That would make it a crime for a taxi driver to pick up somebody who turns out to be undocumented. There's other provisions that are similar to that make it a crime. It's embarrassing for Arizona.
Well, every bill, if you served in state government is somewhat sloppy, and I'll agree with you. But once I'll retort, actually read the bill. I'm not supportive of it, but what I don't like is exaggerations of what it actually does. I think it was poorly written and sloppy like you suggest, but unless you're from Arizona, maybe you don't realize that that's a problem that even on the books of the federal government, that you can't transport people illegally. You see what I'm saying about that? I mean, you can't I mean, that's the law. You might say that's overly broad. How specific do you want them to make it? More specific than the federal government's law? So, like, I completely agree with Professor Simmons' policy arguments for it, and I really do agree with the probable cause reasonable suspicion provision of the bill. But, like I said, let's not exaggerate what the bill does and what it doesn't do.
I mean, actually, I agree that if you were embarrassed by badly worded statutes, I think all states would be embarrassed. I mean, there are a lot of poorly worded statutes. Obviously, I think it's more damaging if it's a provision like this that's overbroad in a criminal context. But I'm not sure. I don't think that's the biggest problem with the bill or the law.
Mr. Kunich, do you have a response?
Alas, I could not hear most of what was said. Could you boil it down to just a bumper sticker for me?
That would be difficult. I guess so the question was about the language of the bill and how it was sort of sloppy. And an example was given that a taxi driver would be penalized under the law for inadvertently transporting someone who turned out to be an illegal immigrant. I guess could you comment to that?
Yeah, technically there could be some problems like that, and that, as my learned opponent said, that's true of many, many statutes, especially the gigantic statutes that are coming out of Washington these days that no one ever reads in their entirety. There are always going to be things like that that aren't reasons to scrap the whole law or ascribe ill motives to those who drafted it, but those are things that should be amended and tightened up. That's not a reason to say that that's indicative that the whole law is racially motivated or unconstitutional or an embarrassment.
Yes.
When I read the bill, I was most worried about how it makes it a criminal offense to not be documented, and how if you're harboring an undocumented immigrant, you could also be criminally liable. How does this affect those who are eligible for D visas, T visas, and B visas, where if you're an undocumented immigrant who's been a victim of sexual assault, attempted murder, human trafficking, or domestic violence, you can go to the police, and as long as you agree to testify, you're given legal status here. In this situation, they would then be criminals. So how would they be able to go to the police, report the crime, testify against a criminal, and get a visa to stay here and testify?
Mr. Kunich, do you want to take that one first? Did you hear the question?
I'm sorry, again, I couldn't hear the question. Bumper sticker for me, please.
So I guess I'll have to repeat the question. So as I understood it, a concern was given about U visas, T visas, the ones for trafficking and spousal abuse or sexual abuse of that sort. And those persons may be illegal, but once they come forward to authorities, especially to the police, and they testify about the nature of the human trafficking and so forth, they can qualify for a lawful visa. How would they be treated since, their first contact with the police, they would technically be illegal?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that indicates other gaps in our legal safety net. Basically, people in that category, their primary problem and the reason they're a concern to our law enforcement agencies isn't that they're in the country illegally, is that they've committed other crimes and have been found to have done so and are on lists that are subject of official concern. This law does not necessarily solve that problem. It is aimed at simply those who are entering and staying in this country longer than 30 days without the proper documentation. People in the category you mentioned are a separate issue and should be dealt with either through amending this law to be more comprehensive, or I think better, addressing those specific areas that talk about people who have committed prior crimes in those categories to get a stronger mechanism for finding them and taking care of them in the way the law expected. This law was not expected to be an umbrella statute that solves all of our problems with people who are illegally in this country for all reasons.
I think the question also brings out another example of a problem with the law as far as how it fails to work well with federal immigration law generally, because federal immigration law has many different categories of people who might be here for different reasons, might have different kinds of documentation for being here. Another example are refugees here seeking asylum. They might be waiting for months or even over a year for their case to be processed. they're legally here while they're waiting, they might not have, someone to have picture ID while they're waiting to show they can be here. How do they prove they're supposed to be here? That kind of documentation. These are, and we have, again, a pretty, I won't say it's well-crafted, it's really complexly crafted federal immigration law that this, a bill like this is not going to go work well with.
Other questions? Yes.
Is there evidence that the number of crimes in Arizona have been disproportionately committed by illegal aliens?
Mr. Kunich, did you hear that?
No, I'm afraid not.
Oh, so boil that down again. So the question was, has there been any sort of evidence that illegal immigrants have disproportionately committed a higher number of crimes?
I have seen some statistics that indicate that Arizona is having a large amount of problem with crimes committed by people who are in the country illegally. I don't recall specifically whether that's a higher rate than those who are in the country legally, but frankly, that's largely irrelevant. If people who are in the country illegally are adding to our problems in terms of the burden on healthcare, education, and law enforcement, then that's a problem we can do without. That's a reason why we have laws on legal immigration, to get a hold of how many people come here and stay here, and to make sure that people who come here are subject to our laws, and those who are here are going to be law-abiding. Whether or not there's a disproportionate problem with people who are here illegally is really to ignore the problem that their very presence in the country is a violation of the law. Remember, illegal immigration is a legal status. It's not an ethnic status. It's not a racial group. It's people who are, by definition, committing a crime, at least violating our immigration laws. When they exacerbate that by committing additional crimes, then that just shows the reasons why Arizona would want to pass a law like that. They are being bombarded from several sides by a population that has already committed crimes, and if they commit more, all the more reason to deal with them under this type of law.
Whether Professor Kunich thinks it's beside the point or not, it clearly was not beside the point to the legislature that passed the law. Again, they named it Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act, and the primary impetus for this was the alleged, series of crimes to be committed by illegal aliens. It seems to me the only logical way you can make that work is a pretty unsavory syllogism, if you will, which is that illegal aliens tend to commit more crimes than other people. Therefore, get rid of them, and you'll make your streets safer. I'm not aware that that's true or not, but I'm averse to following down that road, to saying an entire class of people must be more dangerous and more criminal in nature than others, and therefore have to keep them out. But that's exactly the logic that we have with this bill.
Other questions? Well, I have a question. Mr. Kunich, I guess you just mentioned this, so my question is directed to you, that the concern from the right seems to be that illegal immigrants will sort of disproportionately take their share of education benefits, healthcare benefits, as opposed to government entitlement programs. But given that the number of jobs in the economy is not finite, I guess isn't a better way to tackle this concern to get at the underlying interest, which would just be to say, de-link the government from healthcare, de-link the government from public schooling, and things like that. So, you wouldn't have people getting benefits from the government that, maybe don't pay into the system. I guess you see that concern?
Well, you certainly think big, Armand. Yeah, that's thinking outside the box. If we uncouple the government from healthcare, education, and all the other things, that would certainly change the game. But since we're not going to do that, I think your question, and similar to the response from my opponent to the last one, misunderstands the issue in some way. I don't think anyone is suggesting that people who are in the country illegally disproportionately burden our healthcare, our educational system, or our law enforcement system. I don't think anything in the law presupposes that they are a higher risk of breaking the law or using educational resources or going to the hospital or going on some sort of public assistance or anything else. It just says because they're in the country illegally, that in and of itself is a violation of the law, and they are going to add to the problem because they will consume resources. They will go to school, they will use medical care, they will perhaps go and use some other resources. They may occasionally violate the law. They don't have to do it more than people who are here legally. The fact that they do it at all is a burden that the taxpayers in this country and in this state shouldn't have to bear. They are already adequately burdened with providing for people who are in this country lawfully, paying for national security, law enforcement, education, health care, and all the rest. They don't need to be burdened with additional people who are not paying their own way, who are here illegally, and that is the problem, not a disproportionality. The fact that they're there at all adds to the burden without providing a way out that basically pays their own way.
Just to respond, I think this is one of the myths of illegal immigration, the idea that they are causing this huge burden on our country and giving nothing back. In fact, the majority of illegal immigrants actually do pay taxes. They're not freeloading. They file tax to the IRS. It's not reported to ICE, to ICE. I would at least suppose more of them would actually cooperate with paying taxes and other work with other government organizations if they weren't targeted by this kind of legislation. But to say that they're here sort of sucking your resources away, giving nothing back, is simply not true. And again, you look at people who have studied this over the long term, not long, 10, 15 years, 20 years, immigration is helpful to a state's economy or to a country's economy because the immigrants do assimilate and they do end up paying taxes, becoming citizens that contribute back to society. So I would even reject the proposition that somehow we're getting rid of the freeloaders, the people who are causing a burden on the system. I simply think that's not true.
If I could just rebut very briefly, I think the notion that immigrants are a net gain to society is a long and venerable tradition in this country, and we are a nation of immigrants. But it's a very different situation in the modern era with a full panoply of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, various forms of public assistance. These are a very different situation from the situation that obtained when most of us, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents came into this country, came through Ellis Island. It's much more of a close call or even a very dubious call to say that every person who enters this country is going to give more than they get. I think that that's a questionable assumption given the modern welfare state that Amman wants to abolish.